it's time to start getting a little more complicated and a little more hands-on with a slightly more complicated version of an app. And there's no better candidate for complication than a calculator app. And this is what you're going to be making, this lovely calculator we have on screen. Now, in the next lecture, I'll provide you with all of the images that make up this app's interface, so you don't have to worry about that. But this app has three sort of unique things. First of all, we have a number display pad. It's not an entry box, it simply displays the number we've clicked. It's got a number pad, of course, and it's got a whole bunch of operations that you can perform. Now, on the face of it, this might seem fairly simple, but actually, in the background, it requires a bit of thought. It's not difficult, but it does require a bit of sitting down and actually thinking about what's going on. So this is a fantastic module for showing you how you can break down complex app ideas into really simple execution in terms of code. So with that said, let's go. As always, the approach I like to take when I'm making my apps is I like to do the graphical user interface first if I can and if it makes sense. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to make the main screen of our calculator, and I'm going to provide some resources for you, all of these images, so you can embed those into your app. So let's see how we embed images and create a GUI from it. Open up Xcode and follow along. The very first thing you should do is download the assets that are included with this lecture. They come in a zip file, and on Mac, if you simply double-click that zip file, you'll get a folder, and if you open that, we have all of the numbers and the other symbols that we need for our calculator app. So we're ready to go. Once you've got that, open up Xcode 9, and let's get going with a brand new app. Create a new Xcode project. You guys should be used to this by now. We want a single view app, and we will just call this Calculate Me or something funky, whatever you feel like. We'll leave the options as they are, hit next, and simply save it wherever you want to. I'll save it here on my desktop. Right, so we have our basic app. Now, I just want to introduce you to a few more intermediate ideas of iOS development. And the first thing I want to show you before we carry on is that in this section here, if you click the main project name, we have this info box that pops up. The first tab is called General, and this contains the name and the bundle identifier of your app. The bundle identifier is how the App Store knows which app is yours and how other apps know to open your App Store if you allow that to happen. If we scroll down, we can get to this signing section. Now, if you have a paid-up developer account, or in fact just a free account, you can add your signing here. You need a paid developer account to actually release apps, but you can make do with a free one whilst you're not planning on releasing. Below that, we have deployment info. And in here, we can choose our target, because you might be targeting things on iOS 11 that don't exist in 10, 9, or 8. So you might want to say, at least iOS 11 needs to be on the device. And then the App Store will take care of the rest. It won't let older iOS versions download your app. Below that, we have devices. We can choose iPhone, iPad, or both of them. And then the rest I'm just going to leave for now. So it's just a nice little knowledge freshen up for you so you can understand what's going on whenever this screen loads. Right, let's get back to making our calculator screen. Now, what's the first thing we have to do? Well, the GUI. So we head over to our main storyboard. And as we might expect, this is completely blank at the moment. What do we want to do? Well, we want to drop in some image-based buttons. So buttons that have an image as a background. Therefore, we need images. Now, unfortunately, it's not as simple as I'll just drop in the images I've got. We actually have to go and create what are called image sets. And image sets are an asset. And assets are contained in the assets.xc assets file/folder. If you click that, you'll notice we have an app icon. And if you click that, we have a whole bunch of device sizes and whatnot that come up. So this is where you'll have your app icon in the future, because it's an image. Don't worry about that for now. What we want to do is head to the bottom of this left-hand pane-ish and hit plus to add a group or image set. We want to add a new image set. And then if we double click it, we can actually change that set to anything that we like. So I'm going to call this 1 for the number 1. You could also, of course, call it number 1 if you wanted to. As long as you stick to a decent naming convention, it'll be fine. So how do we get our image in? Well, let's just hit 2x. And actually, just before we do that, we have 1x, 2x, 3x. And these correspond to the display densities of our devices. If you want to know more, just look it up on Google. Image assets iOS 1x, 2x, 3x. They correspond to older devices that had a lower resolution screen and newer devices like the iPhone 7 Plus. What we can do, just for simplicity's sake, is click the 2x empty box. Now it's in here that we're going to drop our image. So if we head over to Finder and get our number 1 image, we can click and drag it and it goes straight in. So that's sorted. We have imported the image. Now in terms of scaling, iOS is going to take care of that for us when it comes to running the app. So we don't have to worry about that for now. There are some considerations later on in your career that you will need to be aware of when it comes to scaling, but for now, we're good with 1 in the 2x. Let's go back to our main storyboard. We want to drop in a button to correspond to that 1. So let's go down to our Object Explorer in the bottom right and type button, then drop it in. Now this button needs to be a square button. So let's fix its dimensions. Let's click our new constraints at the bottom, give it a width and a height, and I think we will have 64. Now, just as a side note, Apple do say buttons have to be 44 in size, 44 by 44 at least. But we're going to make ours 64, make them nice and big. We're going to add those 2 constraints. And of course it shows red, but that is fine. We can just drag things around on one of the corners, and we can make it roughly the size it needs to be. Now this button needs to use that 1 image that we've got. And if you come over to the Properties Explorer on the right, we can either choose image or background image. Now which one is correct? Well, as always, it depends. Let's try them both. Let's select the image and get the drop down. Our number 1 appears automatically, which is great. And if we just resize this again, because it's going a little bit crazy, notice what happens. It's kind of overlapping the button in a very strange way. So what I'm going to do is remove that, and I'm going to choose background image instead. And now the background corresponds to the actual size of the button, whatever we've set it at. The next thing we have to do is remove that button text, because we don't need text. And hey presto, it is almost done. Now you may be tempted to position this inside of your screen right now, but it's not actually a good idea because we're going to have a whole bunch more elements to add. So what we're going to do is we're going to add all those extra elements along with all of these extra images in our assets file. So what I want you to do between this lecture and the next lecture when we continue this layout is I want you to add an image set for every single image that we have. So number 2 here, I'm going to drop in the number 2. And I'll just show you that one more time for completeness. 3 will be the number 3. And you're going to do it for every single one of these images that is left. So go ahead, do that. Just add the images, don't add any buttons yet, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome back. In the last lecture, I asked you to continue setting up all of those images I provided for you as image sets in iOS. So let's have a look at your project and see how you got along. Right, so you should have all of the images, roughly speaking, that you see here. Your names for them might actually be a bit different, and that is perfectly fine. In fact, that's better, so you can begin to understand and think for yourself, what did you call your own image and how do you refer to it? Right, let's go to our main storyboard. So far we have just the one number, which should be roughly 64 by 64. If you grab the corner of one of these images, by the way, or buttons, and you hold down Shift, when you move it in and out, it does it to scale. So it does both the width and the height, regardless of where the mouse cursor is going. So I'm going to have this at 64. Okay, now it is simple enough. We can copy that and we can paste it. And that is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And we can paste it again. So to copy, just hit Command C and then Command V to paste. So what am I doing right now? Well, I'm just laying these things out, very roughly speaking, so that when it comes to it, we can start positioning them according to where each one is. So now once you've got a row 4, we can actually copy that and we can paste the whole row. And we can drop that down here. But there is actually a better way of doing this. So instead of pasting that second row, I'm going to hit Command Z. I'm going to select this first row, which I think I've actually pasted in twice. Let's do Command Z again. There we go, just one. And if you're not sure how many times you've pasted it in, go over to your view here and it will tell you you have 4 buttons. Select them all, and we're going to use this brand new concept called stack layouts. Now, stack layouts, make a box if you like, and that box allows you to place elements in it and spread the elements out inside of that box, more or less equally, or in any configuration that you can think of. So, with our elements selected, way down at the bottom, if I hover down here, it says Embed in Stack. And if I click that button, all of these items get transported into a stack view. And if we look in our list of items, our buttons are now inside of this stack view. This stack view, if we look at its properties, has a horizontal layout. So everything's going to be spread horizontally inside it. Of course, you can also get verticals, but we're not going to do that right now. Then if we select that stack view again, we have some other options. The alignment, we can fill the whole stack view, which I think is what we want to do. We can have everything at the top, the center, the bottom. We can have it any which way we like. Distribution, we can fill items equally, proportionally, equal spacing, etc. Let's leave it at fill. Feel free to actually experiment with these later on if you so wish. Now let's get our stack view. And what are we going to do? Well, I think we'll position this stack view according to the edges of our screen. So let's hit Control. And it's kind of finicky to get it here because you might get a button. So what we'll do is we will hit Control and click this stack view. And we'll head over to our main view and release the mouse. Now we want the trailing space to container. And then we're going to do the same on the other side, which should be leading space to container. But here's something that happens quite often. You've clicked it in the wrong direction, and Xcode has tried to be too clever. It's gone, oh, he's going left to right, therefore he must want this side. It doesn't realize we actually want this side. So that's an issue. Let's try click and drag from the actual object and release. Let's try a leading space. I think that might actually work. And the way to see that it's worked is to go to the constraints under Stack View. Stack View leading and trailing. So that seems to have worked. But always be careful of these constraints because you can spend, trust me, hours fixing these kinds of problems. Right, so that's all sorted. Let's double click some of these constraints and take them right out to the edge. 20 that way, 20 that way. And we've got something very strange happening. Our last image is stretched. So let's click our stack view and let's distribute these fill equally. Perfect. So that fills it nicely. All of these images themselves are constrained to have 64 on each side. But why are they red? Well, they're red because the stack view is trying to expand the image and fill out the screen as much as it can. So it's having a few issues with doing that. What we can do is actually remove these 64s. So select the constraint to remove it, both horizontal and vertical. Takes a little while to do, but it's a good lesson as a programmer that if things are going wrong, always take away items from your display. Right, so now we have it sorted out. So if we select our stack view, there it is. Now we can give our stack view a height. So let's constrain our stack view to, you guessed it, 64. And now we have our button sorted. So we're still getting some red because we haven't positioned this absolutely speaking. It doesn't have a vertical positioning. But what we should do at this point is actually test this on, let's say, an iPad. And then I'll just zoom out for you. Not too much though. And as you can see on the iPad, it has stretched our buttons, which isn't a great look. So how do we get around that? Well, this is your first bit of critical thinking as a programmer. So I told you this section would be sort of an intermediate section. And that is, there are several ways to do it. We can constrain the buttons themselves somehow, but I don't think that's a very elegant solution. We can constrain the stack view. So let's try that. Control click on the stack view and then drag and drop to itself and release. We can set an aspect ratio, which is the ratio of height to width. So let's hit that. I believe that has set itself. Yes. If we go to the constraints, we have height and we have that aspect. If you double click the aspect, you can either change it in the main view or over in the right, you can change the properties over here. So what we want to have is perhaps a 4:1 because there are 4 buttons like so. Excellent. So now we've got that sorted on the iPad. We have a different problem. And this is the beauty of constraining stuff. You'll have problems every single day. So let's hit our stack view once again. Let's check our alignment. Perhaps we can center items. That doesn't work. Distribution. Perhaps equal spacing would work. No, it won't. Fill proportionally? No. Fill equally? No. So the problem really is these constraints on the left and right hand sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select them and I'm going to remove them. So now we just have a free floating stack view that we can move around wherever we like. What we can do is revert to the old classic of let's center this horizontally in the container. Then to double check, we'll click our iOS device, a different one, the 7, down here. Perhaps we'll click even smaller ones. Let's go smallest, iPhone 4S. Okay, that looks pretty good. Everything is constrained except for the vertical. But of course, we know the vertical is coming along very soon. So that's the end of this tiny section on stack views and constraints. Now, constraints are a very, very large topic in iOS. And of course, we're going to cover them as we go so we can understand how they work. But you've got to watch out for when constraints interfere with other constraints. So always add constraints sparingly. Don't just keep adding and adding. That's why I added all these constraints to individual buttons, because I wanted to show you what happens when you work in that way. You just add constraints all the time. You eventually come up against a brick wall made of apples, and it says this isn't going to work. So well done on that. And in the next lecture, we'll complete this display. Welcome to the last part of making our calculator screen. So far we have something that looks like this, and we learnt a lot about stacks and constraining those stacks and not putting too many constraints on the elements inside of the stack, but rather constraining the stack itself and then allowing the stack to take care of the elements that are inside it. So let's finish off the display of our calculator in this lecture. Now, as you might guess, it's as simple as copying our stack view and then simply pasting it. And you can do copy paste from within this list view at the side. So I can paste another one and another one. And I can drag and drop them wherever I want to. Ooh, but not the images. We don't want to do that. Let's hit Command Z and undo that. And let's bring this down. Okay, that's almost perfect. Now, what are we going to do? We have 4 stacks, and I know they're all the same number at the moment, so we're going to change that in a bit. But for now, let's get the layout sorted. Let's select all of these stacks. And actually, before we do that, unselect them. Let's select, let's say, I'm just going to rearrange these because I don't like them being out of order. I think it's an OCD thing. So that one should be the lowest one. That one should be below here. I like them to have an order 1, 2, 3, 4. So when I come to edit, I'm not going to be confused by anything. Okay, so we got these 4 stacks. Now let's position one of them roughly center. So I think this third one we can position vertically in the center. Okay, so that knows where it should be. And if we double click that positioning, we can actually drop it by, let's say, -40 or actually +40. So it'll go a bit further down. And then we have, of course, the final stack view. I'm just going to shove that down a bit. And I'm going to do the same with stack view here. And you'll notice that Xcode helps you out by snapping things together for you, because it knows you want something roughly in line. Right, now if we come back to these alignments of the stack views, first of all, if we click them and we open them and we open constraints, we have our height and our aspect. That's perfect. So what we're going to do is constrain all these stacks together in the vertical sense. Now, we have a few options here. We can control, click and drag to the next stack and place some vertical spacing if we wanted to. We could also select all 4 stacks and we could stack them all in a vertical stack. So Xcode's clever enough to know that these would go in a vertical stack. However, rather than overly complicate things, because I don't think we really have to do that, I am going to hit Control, I'm going to drag down and just click vertical spacing. Vertical spacing and vertical spacing. So now they should all be aligned vertically. So that first one, perfectly in line. Let's test this out by opening up an iPad. And that allows us to see the horrendous errors that we have. So what errors are these? Well, this first stack view is aligned horizontally center, but the rest are not. So we could select these 3 and align them horizontally center, or we could actually align the leading edges, i.e. the edge on the left-hand side, or indeed the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do is select this first stack view, and I don't know why that has moved down. That's very annoying. Let me just rearrange these. Let's get that top one right up to the top. So you can just click and drag these and it will shift them for you. Now let's hit Control and click from this first stack view to the second one. And let's align the leading edges. And look how they snap together. I don't know why the one underneath it has also snapped. Let's see what that's doing. I think it's implied. Well, we can check that in a minute. Then let's select the top one again. Control click to the bottom stack view that's not in line yet and align the leading edge. Right, now let's give this the ultimate test. Put it on a different device. Zoom up a bit. Let's rotate the device. There's a little orientation tab down there. That works. That's perfect. Okay, and then if we select individual stack views, we should have all blue. Now, occasionally, you will get some of these constraints that are duplicated in your project when you copy and paste. I don't know why that is, but it just is. I think it's a bug that's been around for ages in Xcode. So you can remove them one by one if there are too many duplicates, if they're showing red. That's just by the by. Chances are that won't happen to you. Okay, so we've got our 4 stack views in order. My OCD is very happy. All we have to do now is go ahead and select each individual button and of course change the number, and you can change the background image simply by typing what it is, or you can hit the scroll box and search for it that way. So I can just type 4, there it is. 5, this is pretty easy. Oh wait, I've done something wrong here. These side buttons are actually going to be add, subtract, etc. So let's just get those in now. Subtract, what else have we got? Multiply, yellow if you see me pass it. Divide. And add. Okay, now we can do the numbers. Clearly I need help counting. 4, 5, maybe I don't. I'm doing pretty good so far. 6, 7, 8. I think you can see where this is going. 9. And then, of course, we have the number 0. So these last 2 buttons aren't actually doing anything. We need to change these to equals. But there's a little gotcha waiting. And I set that up specifically to get you. The equals button has a different aspect ratio to the other ones. And we are using these stack layouts. So how do we take care of that issue? Well, let's delete one of these buttons and see what happens. Everything spreads out. Let's select this one button. Let's change it to equals. Then let's give this equals button quite a large size. Let's see if that works. Of roughly 128, which is twice the size of a regular button. And look at all these red arrows that appear. Our stack layouts do not like that. So how do we solve this? Well, let's click our stack view first of all, and then let's click this distribution to fill proportionally. Because if we set the width of a button, then it's going to use that width, that aspect ratio, as a proportion of what it should be in the stack that we have there. And it's going to compare that to the smaller buttons and organize things accordingly. And you'll notice we don't actually have to put a height on that either, which is pretty handy. So there we go. Sometimes you can actually put a constraint on one of the buttons, but be very careful when you're doing so. Otherwise, you're going to tear your hair out in frustration when things just don't line up. I know I have. Right, the final thing we're going to do is simply look for a label, drag and drop that, which is going to complete the display of our calculator. Now we'll use some more constraints for this. Let's control click and drag down to the first stack view, and let's make these the same width, which is simple enough by going to equal widths. Perfect. Then let's have this stack view to the label vertical spacing set, but everything is still red in terms of the label. That is simply because we've given it a width, we've given it a distance in vertical, but it doesn't know where it lies horizontally. So we can always go to control click and drag to the stack view, and we can align center horizontals or the leading edge, and everything should turn blue. Now let's just pretty up that label. It's a calculator, so these labels usually go to the right hand side, and over in our properties we can select that option. Then we can select our color. We can leave it as black, I think. It looks quite snazzy. And what do we want to do? We want to find a background color for this label. So let's scroll down and go to background. And what I think we'll do is we'll change slightly. We'll make it dark, and we'll change the color itself to a yellow for the text to make it fit in with all of the other colors. Right, now let's change that font. Let's crank up that size, and you'll notice it expands because you haven't given it a fixed height, so it'll expand as much as it needs to. So just go ahead and expand until it looks visually right. Okay, then double click the label and just put the number 0 in it, as a calculator might start with. Now the eagle-eyed amongst you have probably noticed we're missing a button, and that is this clear button. And I apologize if you've added that already. That's fine. If you've added it, perfectly fine by me. That's okay. You can have it in there. The clear button is actually going to be your homework in a few lectures' time once we've done a little bit of coding. So, speaking of coding, let's get on with that. It's time to connect our main screen to our main code base. Now, if you recall, in previous episodes of this course or previous courses, I've shown you that you can connect buttons one by one via outlets. But look at what we've got here. We have a lot of buttons, and we don't really want to create an action outlet for every single one. So I'm going to show you a couple of tricks so we can take all of these buttons, or rather not that label at the top, but just the buttons, and we can connect them to one or two simple actions in our code. So open up your project and let's see how to do this shortcut. Now, if you recall, beforehand, we would open an assistant editor and we would control, click and drag over to our main code and drop in an outlet or an action if we wanted a button click response. We're going to do something slightly different. So switch off that assistant editor if you've got it running and go over to your viewcontroller.swift. Now inside of here, we're going to write our own interface builder action. And that's exactly the same as control clicking and dragging over to our code. What gets created is an @IB action, which of course is a function. And we're going to call this number clicked. This number clicked is going to pass over what is called a sender. So this is just the thing that identifies what is initiating this action. And we know that this is going to be a UI button type because we only have buttons on our screen and it's only buttons will connect to this. Don't worry about this underscore for now. It's something I'm going to explain later on in the course. Now, so we have an action when a number is clicked. That's great. Let's also have an IB action for when an operator is clicked. i.e. plus, minus, divide, and times, because that's going to perform a slightly different function. Let's have an underscore. The sender, again, is going to be a UI button. Now, we could have both of these functions rolled up into one and then separate them out a bit later in a way that I'm going to show you in a minute. But for this particular project, I think it makes more sense if they're actually separated so we don't get in too much of a mess when we're organizing things. Finally, we might have an equals click, so we want to perform our final action, which might be add, subtract, whatever it is. So IB function equals clicked underscore the sender, which again is a UI button. Perfect, so we got all of that sorted out. Now, how do we connect our graphics to this now that we've specified it? Because remember, at the moment, Xcode or Swift, our compiled program, has no way of knowing that it should connect these. So let's go back to our main storyboard. Make sure you save this file first. Then open up your storyboard. And we can connect our buttons by control clicking and dragging. But to where? Well, we control click and drag all the way to the top at the view controller, and that's going to connect us to the code. So if I release that, it will tell us we have some action segues, things we'll get into later on, but also we have these sent events, equals click, number clicked, operator clicked. And these are all events that we have already created, which is fantastic. So this is going to be a number clicked. Now let's do the same for every single button. Number clicked. Make sure you get the correct one. It's a little bit tedious, but I think a calculator app is the app that you'd have to do this the most on, there being so many buttons. It's not a common occurrence. Whoops, I've clicked the wrong one there. I clicked operator clicked. Right, so I've made a mistake. How do I get rid of that? Well, if I select that 8 button, I come over to my properties, and this very last icon in the top right, Connections Inspector, if I click it, it tells me that I have touch up inside bound to operator clicked. Clearly that's not correct. So there's a tiny little X on the left, and if we click that, it goes away. Likewise, if I click the 7, it tells me number clicked is the event that gets fired. So let's try that number 8 again. Control click and drag, number clicked. Same with 9, number clicked. And of course, 0, number clicked. Now, before we carry on and wire up our operators and equals buttons, there's a problem. You might be looking at this going, well, if I click 1, 2, or 3, how does my view controller number clicked section know which button I've clicked? Well, we can solve that by going back to our storyboard, select the button, and then select the properties. And we can give this a numerical tag. So if we scroll down in this properties section, and at the moment it's the attributes inspector shown, this tag down here is something we can change. So luckily it's numerical. We can make it the same as our button. So in this case, I'll make this 1. For number 2, I'll make it number 2. And you can see where I'm going with this. 3, 4. Just make sure these are all correct. In fact, you can type them in if that is easier for you to do. Number 6, and then of course we have number 7, 8. It's like learning to count. And 0, we can leave as 0. So now we have some tags with that. Let's go back to our code. And how do we find out what these tags are? Well, remember, when this gets fired, the button gets passed over as a sender. So we can grab the tag from that sender. And when we've got the tag, we can use a switch case statement to see which tag we have. So let's have switch. And what are we going to switch? It's the sender.tag. which is an integer. And then we just put in the cases for pretty much everything that we've got. Case 0. And we can optionally have print 0 if we so wish. And we can go all the way through the cases, all the way till we get to default, which we'll just return out of. Now remember, default is what executes if none of the cases execute. But in this case, we know that all of the cases will actually execute. So what we're going to do, we've got a naught to print naught. Let's try a case 1. And in that case, we will print 1. And now that I've done that, I'm actually just going to run this on our simulator. Let's have this on the SC. Just to double check that we get this printed out. Now, I haven't shown you where we print things out yet, but you will see in a minute when this loads up. Okay, back in Xcode, right at the bottom of our main code screen, there's a little icon that says Show the Debug Area. If you click that up, we can now get the output, hopefully, from our app. So if I click 1, it prints out. 2, nothing, because we haven't set that up, but 0 should print 0. So what I've done there is I am debugging the app. Whenever I print, I'm printing to this little output area and nowhere else. So it's a useful tool for us developers to see what's going on in the background. We don't have to set up some elaborate scheme on the app itself, you know, like putting a label at the bottom of it or whatever. As it stands, we can just do it this way. So we have our case, we have our prints, we know that all of that works. Now that I've done that, and I apologize for this, we're actually going to scrap the switch case because every time we send this tag, it is the number that we actually want to show and use to calculate, which is pretty handy. And also handy, that means we don't have to have a switch case for 10 different tags. So let's remove that switch case, or rather, let's cut it and let's paste it into operator clicked. Now, why have I done that? Because our operator, we will need to translate from what the tag is to what the actual operator is. So let's go to our storyboard again. And let's tag up some of these items. Let's have times as the tag number 10. So where are we? Oh, we are on the attributes. Yell if you see it. Can't see it. Oh, there it is. Number 10. Whoops. 10. And we'll have minus as number 11, of course. 12. And 13. Now, let's go back to our code. And if the tag is now 10, let's print times. If it's 11, minus, not 111, just 11. Let's copy that case. Case of 12. And finally, 13. So let me just line these up properly. It was times, minus, divide, plus. Divide and plus. Okay, that's perfect. I'm going to run this now to make sure that I've got those correct. And this is something you need to do as a developer or get into the habit of doing, and that is check, check, and check again. Always check. Assuming your simulator works, of course. So let's go back to our simulator. Let's press home and let's delete that app. So if you click and hold it, hit the X, we can remove it. And then we can run that app again, and it should launch for us. Now, sometimes the output area doesn't show by default, so you just click this little up icon and off we go. Let's hit times. Give it a second to respond. I swear this used to be a lot faster with Xcode. But as of late. But then again, I am running a beta, so what do I expect? Times, minus, divide, plus. And we have absolutely nothing. Why? Because I've been an idiot. I haven't actually connected it, have I? Let's go to our storyboard. Happens to the best of us. Let's control-click our times to the view controller and go to operator clicked. And the same with the rest of them. Wow. Such a newbie mistake to make. Operator clicked. And whilst we're here, we may as well do equals to equals clicked. Now I'm going to run this. And hopefully that is going to work and not embarrass myself any further. Come on, Grant, you're a professional. Right, let's pull up our output. And times, minus, divide, plus. Excellent. So everything's lined up. All our numbers are correct. All of our operators are correct. So that's it for wiring everything up. We're all sorted and we're ready to move on to some more of the more arduous, complicated code. Actually, I lie. It's not going to be that complicated, so don't worry. I'll see you in the next lecture. Now I'm going to show you a little more Swift, a bit of intermediate Swift, in the form of something called enums. Now, how are enums going to fit into our calculator project? Well, so far we've got our operators, and every time we click these at the moment, we're simply printing out what that operator should be, which is fair enough. But the question is, how do we store that operator, times, minus, divide, or plus? Well, that's a good question, because your first gut reaction, and mine, when I started programming, was simply to store it as an operator string, say operator equals something. And that's a fair enough approach. That is a good reaction. But there is something else we can actually use called an enum, which effectively limits our choices, but that has benefits later on when we're programming more complex stuff, because the enum's limit of choices means it's harder for us to make an error, or more importantly, harder for one of your team members to make an error on your precious code, and vice versa, of course. Because if you make an error in someone's code, they are going to hate you forever, because it takes a long time to debug these things. So let's open up our project and learn how to use these enums. Let's create a brand new Swift file in our project to store our enum, because this view controller can start to get a little bit cluttered. Click our project folder, not the top level one, but the one just below that, the orangey yellow one. Right click it, new file, and we have a whole ton of options. We don't want anything complicated, we just want iOS at the top and Swift file. Hit next. Then it asks you for a name for this file. So you should always name this something descriptive and something that doesn't clash with any of the files that you have at the moment or any files that you're likely to add to your project. So in this case, I think we can call this operator enum. I think that's good enough. So we know it's for operators and we know it's an enum. Now, how do we define an enum? Well, as you might guess, enum does it for us. Then let's call this an operator. This is just the name, not the type. Then let's have our colon. And what kind of things is this enum going to store? Well, it's going to store a string. Simple as that. Now, an enum takes a special keyword called a case, just like switch case. So let's add one. Case, add. And add here is just the name. Is equal to And then in quotes, let's have a plus. Now, if you're not a bit confused at the moment why we're doing this, if it seems a bit redundant, don't worry. In a few minutes, it will all become clear. Or at least I'll do my best to make it clear. Let's have one for subtract. A case for times or multiply. And times in programming is an asterisk character. That's on your number keys. Let's have a case for divide. Divide and conquer, that's a /. And then I usually like to have a case for nothing or a case for error, something like that, which in this case, we could actually call this nothing, or we could leave it empty. We're not actually going to use this, but it's good practice to do these things so you can debug better later on. Now, I promised I would define why we're doing this and why it's better to do it this way. We're doing it this way because the temptation is, if we're in our view controller, we could say something like var operator, and we need a capital O for that because the lowercase is reserved, is equal to, let's say, times. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that, it's giving me an error, don't worry about that, except that this is kind of all over the place. I might do this here, I might do another one down here, and can you see how it gets kind of fragmented? By having an enum, we have one single place where we know to change our variable. So when we say later on something like operator.add, we know it refers only to this string. And that's a very important thing to do because it puts all of our data in one spot, so we can change just one spot in the future if we have to. Right, so let's go back to our view controller and let's set our operator. So first of all, we obviously need an operator. So let's go way up to the top and create a class level variable, var current operator. And this is of type, of course, operator, and that enum gets pulled through, is equal to, so when we load up, our first operator is nothing, operator.nothing. Perfect. Then let's go to our operator clicked and start to set that operator. So when our case is 10, we want the current operator to be set to operator.add. Or rather, it's not add, is it? It's multiply. Or times. I'll get there eventually. So that's perfect. We can copy that. Why is that current operator not showing? That's because I need another R there. Great. So we can copy that. And we can do the same for minus. Dot subtract. And the same for divide. And finally, for add. So that's how we use an enum, and we just specify it like we would with any other variable, except it's limited to the options that you actually specify here. So that's the important thing about enums, they're limited, and you definitely want to do that. Right, so what else do we need here? Well, we actually need another enum, because when we're running a calculator, you might hit, and I'll just write some comments here, you might say 1 plus 6 times 9. So we actually need a way of knowing if we've just entered a number or we've just entered an operator, because then we know if we have to perform the calculation. So let's do an enum for this. Let's create another new file, a Swift file, and let's call this one calculation state enum. Now, this is a bit of overkill for what we're doing here, but I just want you to practice this enum concept because it's very, very useful. Let's have an enum calc state, which is going to store a string. And we're going to have a case, first of all, where we are entering a number. And this is going to be a string called entering num. And then we're going to have a case where we're going to have new num started. Whoops, that's a bit of my old programming languages slipping in there, is equal to, and you guessed it, new num started. So we just got two states there. Let's go back to our view controller, and then let's set that up. So, var calc state, which is of type calc state, is equal to calc state dot, and what's the first thing you do when you open up your calculator? You are entering a number. Perfect. Now, I think we will leave this lecture there because you've learnt enough, and we'll continue with entering our enums and writing more of the code of our calculator in the next lecture. It's time to write the basic code and logic that sits behind the pretty, kind of pretty, little GUI of our calculator app. So let's open up your project and get coding. Right, the very first thing that we have to do is store the first number that we enter. So let's create a class level variable called var first value, and we'll set this as a string. Now, why a string, you say? Well, we should actually store it as a number, but it comes in as a string whenever we click those buttons. And it's handy to keep it as a string because we also need to display it in our main label at the top of our calculator buttons. So that's why we store it as a string. So speaking of updating the display, let's create a function in order to do that. So somewhere down here, just create a simple function that updates the display. And this takes the number, which is in the form of a string. Okay, so we've done that now. Now, we're not going to fill that in just yet because we're going to concentrate on the higher level logic here. So let's go to our number clicked function. Remember, this is called whenever we click a number. Now in here, we're going to update the display. So we're going to call that function that we just created. And what are we going to send to it? Well, we're going to send over a string which is made out of the sender.tag. Because if you recall, in our storyboard, we click our image, we actually gave this a tag, which is this over on the right-hand side in properties. So we're pulling out that tag and we're making it into a simple string. Great. Now we can actually go back to our update display and we can write the received number that we have over to our label. But if you recall, if you press the number on a calculator, it adds the numbers, it puts them on the display until you press an operator, and then it shows a little operator symbol, which we're not going to show, it doesn't matter for now. And then after that operator, once you press another number, it starts showing the new number that you're typing. Therefore, we need to check if we're actually starting a new number. So we have to say if our calculation state, and that's with the lowercase c, and if you recall, we set that up in previous lectures, and it's this line right at the top. So if the calculation state is equal to capital C calculation state dot new num started. So we're saying if we're starting a new number, then we're going to perform a certain action. And of course, to go with that, we have the other case, else if the calculator state is equal to the calc state with a capital C dot entering num, then we're going to do something else. So just to make this really, really clear, this section is for if we're starting a new number, and this section is for if we are continuing, if we're continuing a number that we've already started to enter. Right, so in the first if statement, when we have new num started, first we have to grab the text from our display label. So if let num is equal to, and what was our display label called? I don't think we've actually added that yet. So let's go over to our storyboard. Let's click this display label right at the top. And then over at the right, we can click this little connections inspector, and it will tell us if there's a referencing outlet, which should be in this second row. That means that no piece of code is referencing this label, which means we have to do it. So let's open up the assistant editor at the top. You should be used to this by now. Control, click and drag from our label. And let's drop it in somewhere near the top of our view controller class. And let's call this display label. We'll leave its type as UI label, and this is just an outlet. It's just a reference, so we know what we're talking about when we access it in our view controller. So let's head over to the view controller again. Now we can access that display label dot text. We can open and close our curly braces. So I'm just saying, make sure you can actually get something from this text. And then if you can, we're going to use that value. So if that number is not equal to, and this is two quotes, so if it's not blank, then we are going to assign the first value. You remember we created this string up here, first value. First value is equal to the number. And this is just so we have somewhere that we are storing the very first number that we press. Okay, so we've done that. Now outside of the if let num, let's change some other things. Well, the first thing we're going to change is the calculation state, because we've no longer started a new number, we've just done that. So we have to change it to entering number. So let's have calc state is equal to calc state with a capital C dot entering num. Okay, so we've done that. All that's left to do, we've finished all the logic, is actually display that number. So that's simple enough. We just call our display label dot text as equal to the number. And this is the number that gets passed in update display, which in turn is actually passed in via number clicked. So all fairly simple, but there's just a little bit of slightly complicated logic here. We need to know if we're starting a new number or if we're continuing to enter a number. Now, by all means, this is not the only way to do this. There are other ways of doing this. So once you finish this module, feel free to go off and experiment with different ways of doing this. It's a really great way to learn to program when you've got no pressure, experimentation, and just having fun with the language and seeing what you can create. See if you can do all of this in about half as many lines. I think that I could, but the question is, could you? Right? Now, let's handle this else if. So we've entered one number and we are adding numbers to it. Not adding in the math sense, but smushing, to use a really technical term, the numbers together, like in this following sense. Right, so all we're going to do here is go to our display label. We're going to set its text equal to, and what are we going to do? Well, we're going to get the text that already exists in that display label, and then we are going to simply smush on the number that we passed over as a string. Now this is going to give us an error, which is fine, I expected that. And if we click this little red error, value of optional type string, not unwrapped, did you mean to use exclamation or question? Right, so you can fix it. There's a little auto fix icon if we really want to, but I don't want to at the moment because I want to explain here. We've been through a little bit of optionals, and optionals say that perhaps some variable is stored inside a property. Maybe, that's the key word there, maybe. Now, if we're absolutely sure that text is stored under display label, then we can say that we are absolutely sure by hitting Shift and making an exclamation mark. So we're saying, unwrap that, I am dead certain there is a string contained in that display label .text. And how do I know it's a string? Well, the property text is itself a string. And you'll notice the question mark telling you this is optional. So that's your, I think, what's that? Your third or fourth run-in with optionals. So don't worry if you don't get them now. They're fairly complicated to grasp, but just know that you can do this. But only use exclamation or unwrapping an optional if you are absolutely dead certain there is something there. Otherwise, use this. So you're going to test if there is a number in this display label .text. And by number, I actually mean a string. Sorry, it's a bit of a confusing naming there. But coming back to the optionals point, I'm testing here, and here I'm not testing. I'm saying just go for it. In the second version, if there is no string and I unwrap it, this is called force unwrapping, we're going to get a crash. But I'm experienced enough to know that we do actually have text there, and it's okay in this case. Okay, let's test this out. Let's run it in our simulator. And hopefully this display label is going to work just as I expect it to. So we haven't done any other logic yet. There's no operator logic, just the display of the number that we're entering. So let's try it. 7, 5, 2, 3, etc. Okay, so that works pretty well. There's a bit of an annoying thing with 2 zeros at the start, but we're not going to worry about that for now. We're just happy that we're actually forwarding the correct numbers. And of course, there are always going to be errors. I mean, these 3 dots, the ellipsis, as it's called, isn't ideal. But we have the very basics of our app. So we can now move on and do the operator and then entry of the next number. So let's do that in the next lecture. Okay, we're almost there. We have the basic logic of entering numbers inside of our calculator app. And now we're going to concentrate on the rest of it, doing the operators and the equals button so we can actually perform the calculation. So open up your project and let's go. We've already set up our update display. We found somewhere to store our first value. And we've checked if we've got an entering number at the moment or a new number started. So the next thing we're going to do is head over to our operator clicked and finish this little section. Now, if you recall, we had this switch case statement. So we could have somewhere to store our current operator inside of a variable, surprisingly, called current operator. Now, what else do we have to do? Well, we have to tell our calculator that after we've clicked an operator, we're actually going to start a new number. So we have to change, right at the top, our calculator state as new num started. So we've entered one number, we've hit an operator, the next number is inbound. Right, so what do we do after that? Well, we actually want to set our display label text. So let's do an if let num is equal to display label dot text. Remember, we're checking this optional that it actually exists. Let's open and close our curly braces, and then of course we can do something with that. First, we're going to check if the number is not equal to a blank. That's important. Open and close your curly braces. Then we're going to reset our first value to whatever our label has stored. Now, the first value is going to grab this label text, and that is going to be the entire number. So if I just open up the simulator, there it is, it's going to grab this entire number there, and it is going to store it into first value. So we've got somewhere where the number is actually stored. So once we press the operator, optionally, we can then clear the display to let the user know that something has been pressed or something is happening. So we can set this to blank. Right, so that's the operator done. That's pretty much all we have to do. And if you're very new to programming, it helps to think in a very modular way, to think, what should this function be in charge of? What should it take care of? And then really whittle that down to as little as possible. And by doing that, you can effectively create the logic of your app much easier than if this was also accessing various other bits in your program and trying to make everything happen in one function. So sometimes it helps just to make everything nice and simple. So that's my advice to you for the day from a professional developer. Make it simple. The KISS philosophy. I'm not sure that a lot of you know what that means, but some of you will, and you'll be laughing right now. So let's move on. Enough rambling from me. The next thing we have to do is check our equals clicked. And so what's going to happen when we click equals? Well, we're going to do something like calculate a sum. And this doesn't exist yet, so there'll be an error. But let's make it exist. Function, calculate sum. And this doesn't require any arguments to be passed over or any variables because we have everything available in our class. We have the number, we have the operator. Now, if someone presses equals without entering a number, well, that's useless. So let's say if the first value dot is empty. So that means there is absolutely nothing stored in it. Then we're going to return out of this. So it's not going to do any calculations. It will not pass this section. But if that is not true, if we do have a first value, then it will continue executing down here. And you'll notice we don't actually have to put an else. What we can do is simply write code. Because I know this code, whatever I type here, will not be executed because this return will exit us out of the function before we can get to this line. So that's just a handy programmer shortcut for you. So we're going to make what's called a result. And this is going to be a blank string because we haven't calculated it yet. Right, so let's scroll down and perform the actual calculation. So if the current operator is equal to operator dot times, then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to multiply it. So we will make our result equal to the result of the multiplication. Now, I'm going to go into that should be a double equals here. I beg your pardon. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit of shorthand, if you like, and this is very useful for you. So without the shorthand, this would take one or two or three lines more like, but with shorthand, we can do it all in one line. We can say the result is equal to, and obviously this needs to be a string. So let's have two quotes. Now, inside of a string, we can place calculations, variables, and all kinds of things by simply hitting backslash. So we can do backslash. We can tell it that I want you to make a double number from the first value, but this will give us an optional. So what we can do is we can force unwrap it. So what I'm going to do here is just remove this second bracket, and I'm going to force unwrap it. So I'm making a double from the first value, and I'm saying it definitely there. And I'm only doing that because I know that we've restricted our user to just entering numbers on our label. So that's all we can actually get out of it. And there's no way they can circumvent that. Okay, so once we've done that, we are going to multiply, because this is times, that's the asterisk. And then we are going to double the display label dot text. And of course, this also needs a force unwrap because it might not exist, but we know that it actually does exist. So now why is it giving me an error? Well, I've got these two brackets just right on the outside here where my cursor is hovering. So one up here and one down here. Now, what's the issue? Well, Xcode is telling me that this result itself could actually be an optional. And if I click the red icon, string not unwrapped, did you mean, etc., etc. Well, we can just click fix. And it's going to put an exclamation right at the end. So we've unwrapped this conversion, we've unwrapped that conversion, and then we've unwrapped this final multiplication result. So if you're not an experienced programmer, this is actually a little bit dangerous to do, just force unwrapping everywhere. But as you get more experience, you'll understand where you can and where you can't do this. Now, I apologize for taking a long time on this section, but it's an important concept for you to understand. Right, so let's quickly whip through everything else. And that's easy enough because we can just simply copy this. We can type else, and we can paste it. And we can just go through all of our different operators and then change the appropriate symbol for the calculation itself. So let's just do that 2 more times. Was it minus or subtract? Perhaps it was subtract. There we go. Let us subtract it. And finally, addition. Okay, so that's all pretty simple for us because it's a pretty simple calculation. So what's left to do? Well, inside of this calculate sum, we should show the result. Let's have a display label dot text is equal to the result. Perfect. Then what do we want to do? Well, don't forget we have a calculation state. And once you've pressed equals, you've finished a sum, the state should now be a new number started. So it knows to start again. Right, that's been quite a long haul. So let's hit play. Let's see that all of that works. It tells me we have a failure to start, failure to launch. So let's just click the home button. Let's remove the offending app. Click the home button again, and then let's rerun it in the simulator. Right, bingo. Let's say 2 times 3 equals 6. Perfect. 9. Hang on, it's having a moment there. Divided by 3 is equal to 3.0. And I think my simulator is doing something weird because it's removing that black background. So I think that's just a bug. There is no coding reason whatsoever why that should be happening. So there we have everything working. Let's have 4 times, yeah, it's just a coding bug, I think, 5 equals 20. Or not a coding bug, but an Xcode bug. Remember, we're still in beta. These things will happen, so don't stress out about them. Right, so that's our very simple calculator sorted. But of course, there are bits and pieces that are a bit annoying and certain things that a calculator wouldn't have if you actually publish this. So in the next section, I'm going to set you a few tasks for you to spruce this up and add that mysterious clear button that we never added in the first place. So see you in the next one. Right, here we go. This is the homework, the first homework that I'm going to give you, where I'm not going to give you any clues. We have a calculator. It does all the calculations we need. But what if we make a mistake? Well, it would be nice to have a clear button. And I've provided one in that graphics pack for you. So I want you to take that provided clear button and I want you to put it somewhere on our screen so that when a user presses it, everything resets back to the beginning state of the calculator. And as a little bonus, I would also like you to remove that leading 0 in the label. You know, the one that always pops up whenever the calculator starts. So 2 tasks, clear button and the functionality behind it, and remove that leading 0 when the calculator starts up. I've got a solution for it, but I want you to show me what your solution is before you have a look at my one. Good luck. There were a few things that bugged me, and probably you, about the calculator we created. First of all, there was that horrible leading 0 in the label. And secondly, there was no clear button if we made a mistake. So let's add that clear button and remove that horrible little 0 by opening up our project and seeing what my solution is. With our main storyboard open, let's click this label, and in fact we can double click it. We can simply hit backspace and remove that item, hit enter, and then the label will be blank. And I think I've just found the root cause of that bug I was referring to. When there's no number in there, it actually makes the label disappear. And I'm not sure what that's all about. Let's do Command Z again to undo that. And if we click the label, let's inspect it. Well, the first thing you'll notice, it has no fixed height. And that's actually the problem, I think, because when you remove the letter, it's got nothing to contain, so it just collapses to what it should do. So with that label still selected, let's add a fixed height. So it's at 45.5. We'll just add that now. Now, if we double click it, backspace and hit enter, our label still stays there. So turns out I was wrong. I apologize, Apple. It's not a bug in your software. It's a bug in my software. Okay, so that sorts out the 0. Now let's get serious. Let's sort out that clear button. First of all, let's go to our assets.xcassettes. Check we have our clear button added. If you don't have it added, hit plus at the bottom, new image set, and just drag and drop it into the 2x. So it's there. Let's go back to our storyboard and let's drop in a button somewhere. Now, we've got this nice symmetrical grid, but I think we could actually drop this right at the bottom. So let's find our objects and the button inside of there. Let's drag and drop the button in. Then, with that button selected, up at the top, let's show the attributes. Let's scroll down to our background image. Where was it? There it is. And let's have clear for that. Now, this button isn't going to be part of any of these stack views that we created. So we're just going to have it right at the bottom of our calculator, or maybe at the top even. Haven't decided yet. So we're not going to bother with messing around with stack views. Instead, we're going to give it a fixed width and height. And let's try 44 by 44 and add 2 constraints. Great. And of course, we can resize this and what have you, just roughly speaking, until we move it into position. Now, where should we put it? We could put it at the bottom, but I think a more usual place is at the top somewhere. So let's select this top label, and let's select this constraint that positions it between the two sets of numbers. And if we double click it, we can make this a bit larger to make a bit of space to put our clear button into. So let's give this perhaps 70 as a clearance. And that's too much, because you can see it's moved off of the screen. Let's try perhaps 60. 55, and it's back on the screen. Great. So we'll leave it at that. Then let's get our C button, and let's remove this button label because we don't need that. Hit enter. Let's click and drag it between these two items, and you'll notice Xcode will line things up for you almost automatically all the time. So I'm going to pop it in there. Now what's next? Well, we need to position it. So control click and drag to the label, and let's align the leading edges so it knows where it is there. And let's click and drag to the display label, and let's have some vertical spacing set. And all those red marks should go away. Okay, so I'm just going to save that, and we have our clear button. So it kind of stands out, but that's what a clear button should do, I think. Now we need to connect this to our view controller. So we have a few options. We can connect it to a button press, an operator pressed, or something like that. Or we can just give it its own little function. Let's do the latter. So let's open up the assistant editor. Let's control click and drag once we've scrolled down a bit. I think we'll put this somewhere near the bottom because it's not that important for our calculator. Control click and drag, and down it goes at the bottom. Let's change this to an action, and let's call this clear button clicked. Okay, and click connect. Now switch off the assistant editor, go back to the view controller, and let's fill out that function we just dropped in. So what do we have to do? Well, first of all, we need to clear our display label. So that's simple enough. .text is equal to blank. Then we need to tell our program that we are starting a new number. So the calculation state needs to be updated to a new number started. And that should be it. And again, I'm just going to repeat what I said a few lectures ago, and that is, if you get this logic right and you figure it out in a modular manner in your head, then these functions become really simple to actually create. See, I just have to put 2 lines in here, and I've already cleared everything. Perfect. Okay, so the next thing we have to do, of course, is hit play and double check that all my grandstanding is actually for something good. Come on. There we go. Okay, so let's have a 2 times 33, I guess, equals 66. Fair enough. But what if we say 9 divided by, let's cancel that. Gone. Now let's say 2 times 2, 22, equals 44. So our clear button actually works. And also, as a bonus, we don't have that horrible 0 that existed before in our label. So, nice and simple homework. I hope you got the solution in as few lines as that. If you didn't, don't worry, because you will get there eventually. The important thing is you keep trying. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Well done for completing this module on creating a nice, simple calculator. This is just a summary of what you've achieved so far. First of all, good job. This was a pretty tough one, and there was some quite complex logic. Now, in reality, most apps won't have logic that's as confusing as this is, because a calculator in and of itself is quite confusing logic-wise. So don't worry if you didn't get all of it. Right, we turned this jumbled mess of symbols into a slightly less jumbled mess of symbols with some logic behind it. We also learnt quite a few things that are important for us programmers along the way. Primarily, we learned about stack layouts when we were designing our calculator and how to use those effectively. I also showed you a couple of things that act as gotchas, mistakes that you can make, and you'll wonder what the hell's going on until you realize you've added a constraint wrongly somewhere. Then we looked at multiple button actions, i.e. assigning the same action to different buttons and just using their tags to identify them. Tags, like I just said. And then we looked at a whole bunch of logic, but more importantly, we broke that logic down into simple variables that we kept track of, like the calculator state and the first number. We learned about enums, so we restricted ourselves to storing certain values for our variables, which is an important exercise to make sure that your programs in the future don't get too fragmented. It's important because it keeps all of those variables in one spot, and that's the only spot where you actually have to change them. And finally, we looked at some good design principles, or rather good layout principles, not really design, because as fantastic as the calculator is, it wasn't that great a design, I'll be honest. I'm sure you could come up with better, but it served the purpose. So good layout principles, where we put our clear button, how we line things up on the screen. Right, so that's the end. You deserve a break, go have a glass of wine, and I'll leave you with a little firework.